My name is Emma Barnett. I am the executive director of the Woolf Institute, and I'm a trained sociolinguist. And as a sociolinguist, I observe communication between people. And this is the reason why I was so intrigued by the radio interview and by the controversy that arose after the Women's Hour episodes were screened when Emma Barnett had interviewed Zara Mohammed. And I'm very, very thrilled to welcome such an esteemed group of academics, activists, and journalists to unpack this conversation today with us here. So let me introduce the panelists. We have with us Julie Siddiqui, who's always a very welcome guest at the Woolf Institute. She's the founder of the Big Iftar, of Nisa Nashim, one of the big women's organizations, grassroots organization dealing with Muslim and Jewish women, Salah Gradeh, and Open My Mosque. We also have with us Lord Charles Moore, who's a columnist and former editor of the Daily Telegraph, the Spectator, and the Sunday Telegraph, who's also a member of the House of Lords now. Our next panelist is Alisa Simon, who's a PhD scholar in sociology at the University of Oxford. She's a Woolf Institute MPhil alumna and also now a Woolf Institute PhD scholar. And she also serves as the Jewish chaplain at the University of Cambridge. We also have with us Professor Robert Toombs, who is an emeritus professor of French history, who has become quite a media don of late, as we say, in Cambridge. He's strongly affiliated with the Woolf Institute as a member of our research committee. We're very pleased to have him here. And last, but certainly not least, we have Dunya Habash, who's doing a PhD at the University of Cambridge in ethnomusicology. She's a PhD scholar at the Woolf Institute and a lead of our Living in Harmony outreach project. And Dunya is actually joining us from Istanbul, where she's currently on fieldwork. So today's discussion will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A period, where we want to hear your thoughts and questions. Please post in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen throughout the discussion, and make sure to upvote the questions that you would like to explore. So we're now turning our attention towards this radio interview that caused such a controversy concerning religious and journalistic issues, and also pertaining to women's equity. For those of you who are not familiar with the interview itself and the fallout, let me give you an overview. On 4th February, Emma Barnett interviewed Zara Mohammed, the newly elected head of the MCB, the Muslim Council for Britain, for Women's Hour. After a conversation about her appointment, the chat became confrontational when Emma Barnett started questioning Zara about the number of female imams in Britain, after seemingly getting frustrated about Zara's avoidance of a clear answer on the topic. This then continued when Emma asked more questions about women in Muslim communities and the role of the MCB. And a few days later, this radio interview led to a public discussion about the interview, which culminated in an open letter that was sent to the BBC, was signed by a number of public figures. It was asking the BBC to address its engagement with and representation of Muslim women. And for those who have not seen the footage and the letter, the links to that are now in the chat. So in private conversations, I've heard a lot of different opinions expressed. There was critique of the tone that Emma took with Zara. It was described as hostile, accusing her of silencing female Muslim voices. There was talk of white feminism. Defenders of Emma's style, on the other hand, have pointed out that this is her usual style of conducting an interview, which she has brought to Women's Hour since she was appointed in the beginning of January. For example, in a Guardian article from the 8th of January 2021, she was called a seriously tough interviewer. And she employs these tough techniques when she feels she's not getting a straight answer. So Julie, first to you. You're an activist for inclusion and Muslim women's rights in religious community and society. Did you hear also this sort of variation of views? And could you share with us your views and your reactions to the situation? Julie, unmute yourself.
Gosh.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for having me, and a very fascinating conversation I'm sure we're going to have about this. So yeah, in answer to your question, yes, I did hear many different views, people messaging me, and I saw all sorts of things online. People messaged me actually about how in some ways they felt frustrated that Zara came across ill-prepared. Some were saying it was deliberately Islamophobic, and that Zara was ambushed. I saw that term being used. And some even touching on this being some sort of Zionist lobby conspiracy, and very much sort of pitching it in that way. I think many Muslims and others actually felt quite let down by it. I think people saw it as a missed opportunity, unnecessarily aggressive. I think Emma Barnett, became harsher as the time went on. I re-listened to it again actually this morning just to kind of refresh my memory. You could very much hear her tone kind of get harsher when she felt that Zara wasn't answering the questions, I guess, in the way that she hoped she would, perhaps. I think the way that it was then framed very much, in fact, even as you framed it today, I'm not sure I necessarily think about it in that way. The sort of Muslims versus the BBC, I'm not really sure that helps us either. I think representation matters, and I think that we need to think about how we need to be smart about how we kind of approach these issues and how we, in a way, call out things when we don't like what we see. I chose not to sign the letter. I didn't really feel that it was a way that I wanted to approach this topic, but I respect people that did, and there's many of my friends and colleagues that signed it, of course. I think the appointment itself was, of course, very positive. It definitely kind of broke a glass ceiling, for sure. Muslim women in particular feeling very much hopeful and optimistic about it, but also realistic. There are challenges in Muslim communities, that is for sure. And one appointment, of course, doesn't change all of that. There are real teachings being used in very, very damaging ways, or misused, I could say, and how that's playing out in Muslim families and communities. But there are also Muslim women excelling in pretty much every field that you can think of, and acknowledging that these issues are there as well. I think for me, one of the things that's disappointing about it was that Zara came across very defensive when she was asked about certain issues. And I think that was disappointing and a shame. I can understand partly why that happened, but I think it was a shame when she was asked about the lack of diversity within the MCB, and when she was asked about the sort of socio-economic issues within Muslim communities, particularly among Muslim women, she kind of was very defensive. And I think that I know that she knows that there are issues, and that her appointment doesn't do away with those issues, and that issues around diversity within the MCB and also around leadership in Muslim communities is, of course, an issue. So I know that she knows that. So when she was defensive about it, I felt that was a shame, and I felt she could have owned that much better and responded in a more kind of proactive way. I think the question that really became quite central in the end, unfortunately, this question around female imams, Zara was completely thrown by it. You could hear it when the question came. She hesitated and was completely thrown. And I think thereafter, she felt off her guard. And I really felt for her in that. And I think one of the reasons for that, there isn't actually a straight answer to give on a question like that. I would have answered it different. Someone else would have answered it different, but actually she was completely thrown by it. And I could see why. I think there's kind of a different set of issues or clerical structures when it comes to the Jewish community and Christian communities, but actually it's very different among Muslims. And so I think if you frame a question in the way, thinking of it from the perspective of those other communities, it's going to be very difficult to answer it in a very straightforward way. Imams in mosques are men, generally. Most opinions say that's okay, but there are people that also say that women can lead mixed groups as well. But most Muslim women that I work with, while they're very passionate about inequalities, and that's very much there in their DNA and the work that they're doing to try and challenge, this topic around women being imams isn't right up there as the number one way to frame the issues that we do have. So I think that in itself is why people found it disappointing. And I think there is definitely a question and a conversation to be had around religious literacy among journalists, among people, in a position like Emma Barnett is now in, particularly on a program like Women's Hour. Could that be better? Yes, I think it could. I think Emma Barnett and her researchers definitely fell into the trap of kind of focusing on framing things around usual stereotypes. And I think that was why people felt disappointed. And I think that more Muslim women voices definitely need to be heard. but we need to think about how to do it. And I think have the conversations. That's why for me, it's not about attacking the BBC or attacking a newspaper. It's about saying, right, okay, what do we do now? Because clearly, if we're going to continue to fall into these stereotypes, we need to change the way that we do this going forward.
Thank you very much, Julie. Lord Moore, as a columnist and a former editor of the Daily Telegraph, you are a fellow journalist to Emma Barnett. Do you have anything to say about Emma's interview style and about journalistic integrity in such an interview? You need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, you must have shut me up at an earlier point. I thought Julie's analysis was very interesting, and I agree with it on a lot of points. But I think we do need to pursue the journalistic aspect of this, as your question does. First of all, we have to remember that what this program is called, it's called Women's Hour, and therefore it raises questions about women for women. And Julie was talking quite a lot about how what Muslim women might have thought about this, and obviously that's interesting and important, but this is for all women. And it's only natural that Emma Barnett should have asked, as it were, a secular question from a secular point of view about the role of women in Islam in the form of imams. Now, I'm sure I would suspect that she didn't know a great deal about the gradations there, but it's a key point and a sensible, perfectly reasonable question. And I thought it was, her interviewing style was direct, but not rude. And Julie's right to say that it became more insistent, but that was because she wasn't getting an answer. And an interviewer is entitled to get an answer. If the person comes on, and I think Julie was right here too, that Zara Mohammed hadn't been properly prepared. This was not a surprising or peculiar question to be asked in your first outing on a women's program when you were the first woman Director General of the Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Britain. So I think it was all perfectly legitimate and perfectly reasonably framed. And I'm afraid I think it did show that Zara Mohammed, though clearly a well-meaning person, was very sort of constrained, and it was almost as if one felt that somebody else was controlling her because she just didn't seem to have the authority to give answers. But she almost said that herself, because she said, you know, this is not my business, I don't talk about this sort of thing, and so on. And you wondered, well, if you've got this excellent opportunity on this important program, what are you going to say? I think that was left with that unsatisfactory feeling, and the sense that Emma Barnett, she might have been a little bit tough for the first outing of a person, but I think basically she was asking fair and clear questions, and she didn't get fair and clear answers.
Thank you very much. One of the points of criticism was that there is a style of questioning that undermines a woman's voice and one that holds her to account. So this was mentioned in the letter. So with Emma Barnett clearly falling into the former category of someone who undermines a woman's voice. Other journalists such as Kenan Malik for The Guardian have argued that Muslim leaders should be questioned like everyone else. Mm-hmm. Yeah, as a young Muslim woman and an emerging thought leader, what are your thoughts about this? Do you have personal experiences where you felt more undermined than being held to account in an interview or in a situation?
Yes, thank you, Miriam. Well, firstly, I just want to start off by saying that although I am a Muslim woman, I do not claim to represent all Muslim women everywhere. Like any community or group, you know, we're diverse and there's no one voice that can represent all perspectives. But I can speak from personal experience as a Muslim woman who grew up in, you know, the West, quote unquote. And in terms of your specific question, Miriam, I think in general, it's really very difficult to tell the difference often between feeling undermined or being held to account about specific issues related to Islam and women in particular. And what I do know is that I personally have often struggled as a young Muslim woman growing up in the United States, especially as a hijabi Muslim woman. You know, often I did feel that my hijab or my head covering would speak louder than my words in many situations, that there's this immediate kind of natural stereotyping that happens as soon as I entered a room or gave an opinion that is kind of not what most people would think my opinions should be about particular topics, especially about the oppression of women in minority communities and other issues. So I do think that we have to acknowledge that this does tend to happen towards Muslim females growing up in Western societies. And, you know, it's natural. I mean, we are the minority, especially for me. I grew up in the South. I grew up in Alabama, actually, in the United States, which is a big part of the Bible Belt of America. So I was in a double minority, you can say, in most situations. So I think, though, you know, this issue of like, offending our Muslim women or not giving Muslim women a platform, or, you know, arguing about whether or not they should be questioned. I mean, of course, I think everyone should be questioned, whether or not you're of a minority status, that shouldn't matter. And I agree, although, you know, with what Charles said about the fact that it was a secular question, or it was a natural question that she should have expected. I do wish she had just answered honestly and, you know, not flustered a bit. But that's also very natural, given the kind of, I think we forget about the context of you know, what it's like to be a Muslim woman who's just been elected as the first female leader of this big council in the UK. I mean, there's just a lot of pressure that I think a lot of people not in the place of a Muslim woman growing up in the West are just not going to feel or understand. So I think, you know, we have to just be very nuanced with how we approach these issues, and in general, you know, just be very honest with each other, and also acknowledge that you know, the elephant in the room, and that is the kind of decontextualization of Muslim migration to the West and the kind of colonial processes that brought about this migration in the first place. I think we often forget about this history, and we just observe from the outside minority Muslim communities and their quote unquote lack of ability to assimilate or integrate into modern secular democratic societies. So I just think there's a lot more around these discussions that need to kind of come to the foreground of our thoughts about the issue of, you know, Muslim women or Islam in the West, and the female participant basically in these communities. So that's what I have to say about your question.
Thank you, Dunya. We're having problems with mics muting ourselves. Thank you very much. And of course, I mean, this is something that, you know, this whole debate about equity and equality that we're probably sort of talking a little bit about later as well. A question for Robert. Some of the criticism has focused on the ignorance that Emma displayed when she talked about female imams. Obviously, she knew very, very little about the clerical structure. Some felt that a Catholic woman heading a Catholic institution wouldn't have been asked to answer a question like that about the number of female cardinals or a female pope. Robert, as a Catholic, do you agree that there are double standards, or have you seen similar controversies about faith and feminism in Catholicism?
I suppose you should say I'm of Catholic heritage, as we might say. It was, yes, I mean, when you and I were sort of talking informally about this, I did say I wondered how one would react if a nun were to be asked how many female priests there were. I'm more of a cynic than most of you, because I felt that she knew the answer to the question. You know that lawyers are supposed never to ask a question they don't already know the answer to. And I assumed that she did know that there were no female imams in Britain, and that this was what she was trying to get her to admit. But perhaps I'm wrong about that. Perhaps she really didn't know. My very limited experience of broadcasting, very limited indeed, is that they give you a pretty easy ride if they think you're an amateur, which I've always been whenever I've appeared on any media, and they don't. But if they think you're a professional, a politician, for example, or perhaps another journalist, or someone who's a spokesperson for an organization, then they're often quite tough, because they think that you are prepared and that you are trying to get across a message and use them as an opportunity to do that. And that's what I sort of assumed must have happened here. There's obviously a question of civility. You know, would you ask a Catholic nun to say how many? Would you keep saying, well, you know, why aren't there any female priests in the Catholic Church? You could ask that question, but it would be in some ways a rather silly question because we all know the answer. And therefore, you might say a more intelligent conversation would be to direct it rather differently and to say, are you as a, okay, I'm imagining this whole conversation, of course, you know, are you as a very active nun who's who runs a hospital in Africa? Are you happy that there are no women in the priesthood? You know, you might, and the person might say yes, because you know there are all sorts of things you might expect. But it would be odd to say that you had no opinion or you didn't know. But so if this is a question of partly of civility and partly of what it is you're trying to do in the interview. But there I leave it at that because you know more about this than I do. But obviously it raises far broader questions. If a Catholic nun had been asked these questions, a few people might have been annoyed by it, but it would not have caused a great public outcry. And therefore, what the question that's being brought up is really about Islamophobia. Is criticism of Islam Islamophobic, or what kind of comments about Islam are permissible? And this, of course, connects with the whole idea of intersectionality and whether groups that are in some ways underprivileged in a number of different ways, socially, economically, and as cultural minorities, should be treated differently from those who are members of or representatives of dominant groups. And you can either agree with that or not. But it seems to me that's obviously what was behind this. And there are three, and I'm putting this crudely because I'm a historian and we tend to be rather crude, I think. There are three ways of approaching this, I suppose. One is what you might call the French approach. And just to say everyone is an equal citizen, religion is a private matter and has no effect on your public life. And therefore you can be asked any sort of questions, you can be exposed to any kind of criticism, and that is simply one of the rules of life in a secular society. Or you could take let's say the multicultural approach and say that you have to treat certain cultures with respect because they are in some ways equated with race and with personal identity and personal integrity and all the rest. And the third one is what I suppose you could call the British approach or the pragmatic approach, which you could also call muddling through, or you could call hoping that the problem will somehow sort itself out and go away. Which is that you really have to, someone talked about nuance, and I suppose that's really what it is, that you don't adopt hard and fast rules, but you try to behave in a way that is not calculated to inflame feeling unnecessarily, that you try to be polite and understanding, even if that means that you risk letting certain problems pass unnoticed. Whether this is the best approach or not, I don't know, but it is the one we've got, and it's probably the one that we're going to continue with, and it may even be the one that works best in practice. So in this particular case, if I'm asking...
Thank you, Robert. I think you've gone slightly over time. I'll have to...
Right, I'll stop.
You're a typical academic. You're going on slightly too long.
Well, 50 minutes I'm used to.
Yeah. So we'll move on with the discussion, but we'll come back to your points later in the discussion. Is that all right?
Yes, as you wish.
Thank you, Robert. So leading on from some of the points that Robert just made, one of the points that Zara tried to make clear was the frustration that a lot of women sort of Muslim women or women of faith in general feel about certain expectations in Western society of how women have to live, how that Western society has quite a rigid definition of the type of lifestyle that reflects female equality or female fulfillment. And that's often quite contradictory to the way that religious women live their lives. So as a Jewish chaplain, Alisa, do you have any sort of similar experience of this or any reflections on this topic?
Yes, thank you so much, Miriam. That's a good question. Also, thank you so much for having me on this very honorable panel. So I think really Western lifestyle, if we think about, women individualism in Western society, it focuses on women's career and career equality for women. And I think that there is a silent expectation when I reflected on your question in the Western world that as a woman, you get your career rolling first, and then you can start thinking about having a family, or you need to juggle career and family life. And this is very much something that we all discuss and see regarding women equality. And on Women's Day, so many conversations centered around this. And I think for many women of faith, and I'll speak from the perspective of the Jewish community, and the more conservative parts of the faith community you look at, the more this is true. Family life and having a large family is a central part of a female religious identity. But in a secular context, people are often surprised that I, for example, yes, I'm a PhD student, that I have a child, that I had a child at such a young age. And then in my Jewish community, and as a chaplain and a wife of a rabbi, people sometimes give me comments that I'm a little bit behind schedule. And I think that this is something that I discuss with my female students about this inside versus outside perspective of being a woman of faith and having these different standards. And I think this is also something that we saw on the interview, discussions that Zara was able to have within her community and things that she was unable to have or felt that she couldn't explain on the outside. And relating to the second part of your question about awareness. So I think that as a Western society, we are getting better at accepting diversity. I think we're more and more used to seeing women cover their heads with headscarves, with hats, with hijabs, and recognize that this is an important religious symbol that reflects serious choices. But I think that we also need to start recognizing as a society that issues like having a robust communal life or family planning is a facet of religious identity, and that this too should be measured through, this shouldn't be measured, sorry, through the regular Western equality scale. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Alisa. So now we're sort of opening up more to the panel, but I'll do a bit of a segregated, sort of gender segregated question on this one, because I felt another issue that really played out in the background of this whole discussion was that of women's solidarity. So some people I spoke to did not expect that sort of harsh questioning as part of Women's Hour and by a woman to a woman. So women in the round, what do you think about that? Julie, do you want to start?
Yeah, can I just be cheeky and just respond or sort of tie something together before I respond to that, just very, very quickly? I just wanted to say that I think what's really important, and in a way, it kind of links with what both Robert and Charles have said in terms of, well, a question is asked, so someone needs to just answer the question. But it also links then to what I think Dunya said as well around anti-Muslim prejudice and sort of pressure and this sort of spokesperson idea, which can be, you know, is helpful, but can also be very challenging. And for someone in a position like Zara's with all of that pressure, not only from Muslims who will be wanting her to say the right thing and they'll be scrutinizing everything she said or didn't say on their behalf wrongly, there is also this other side of it where Zara would have been very aware that whatever she said in response to the question about female imams, it would have been potentially misrepresented, could have ended up on the front page of a newspaper or in a headline somewhere and misaligned what she was actually trying to say. That's why I think she felt kind of, realizing all of that at the same time. And I think we have to really be very clear about that. But I just, going back to your other question about faith and women of faith working together, look, for me, it's some of the most exciting, potentially exciting work that I think still needs to happen more and more. And some of the most brilliant stuff that I feel I've been involved with over the last few years has been women of different faiths working together, navigating some of the difficulties that we actually share. It's very easy for people to say, the poor oppressed Muslim women, we become this kind of people that everybody feels they need to save somehow from themselves. But actually, once you start talking to women of different faiths and we have those honest conversations together, a lot of the issues around gender inequality, around lack of female leadership, around how the institutions are very male dominated, all of that stuff, some of which, frankly, plays out kind of in plain sight in some faith communities, but is still there. We as women are and can be having those conversations to say, okay, what are we going to do to try and support each other on some of this stuff going forward? And, I remember the Archbishop of Canterbury, I was at an event, we were talking about gender and leadership. I asked a question, the answer was fudged, it wasn't answered properly. He came to me afterwards and said, look, if anybody from the, if you like, the Christian community tries to tell you that, or anyone tries to tell you that we have it sorted when it comes to gender and leadership and faith, of course we don't, is what he said to me. And that, 2000 years later, we're still trying to figure this stuff out. So, I think it for me, it's very empowering to have worked with you know, Orthodox Jewish women or Catholic women who are kind of challenging the status quo, but still remaining very much firm in their faith, still feeling very much that they want to stay within their faith communities or within their institutions, but actually challenging the patriarchy, the misogyny, the misinterpretation of the faith and the scriptures, you know, together. And for me, that is what gets me the most excited, and, you know, the stuff that I think we can do more and more of that in the future.
Thank you, Julie. Alisa and Dunya, do you have anything to add? Alisa.
Yeah. Yes, I think that there definitely is. When I listened to that interview, I felt that she was cutting into what Zara was trying to say. She was cutting her answers. And I felt that was really unfortunate. And I think that when we have these interfaith dialogue, these settings where we're together, even though I don't think the Women's Hour was framed in this way, but afterwards, obviously, it was discussed, the Jewish identity versus the Muslim identity. I think that's content in the room that we should be really, really careful about when having these conversations. And just, I always am an advocate for empathy and for having good conversations and having debates and robust debates is important. But I always think that in these types of settings, it's just good to be a little bit more polite sometimes, or a little bit less adversary. That's my preferred way of handling these kinds of situations.
Dunya?
Yeah, I just very briefly wanted to comment on Julie's point about, I do agree. I think the reason why she flustered, why Zara Mohammed flustered, is because of that, the possibility of anything she said could have been, you know, turned into a headline and misrepresented, and, you know, just recognizing kind of the pressure, like, just I do not envy her for that position, actually. The pressure of saying the right thing to both communities, because it is a very difficult one to navigate, because you have to be correct in this one, and you have to also be correct in this one. And this is where I think a lot of, like, modern female Muslim subjectivities are battling with these issues, especially those who are living in Western secular democratic societies. I mean, I know I have struggled with this pressure my whole life to represent the Muslim female in a good way to my Western secular colleagues without forsaking, you know, a lot of core tenets and beliefs that as a person of faith, I try to practice in my daily life. And I think Alisa also touched on these issues too, with some of the examples, personal examples that she brought to bear. So I just think it's important for us to recognize how much pressure is being placed on Muslim communities today, especially with growing Islamophobia and, you know, all of the media that we hear about the Middle East and what's happening in the Middle East. And I mean, there's just a lot that we as Muslims are battling in the modern world, I would say. So I think it's important to remember that.
Thank you, Dunya. I'm not turning to the men in the round. Do you have anything to reply? What would make you listen to Women's Hour? What sort of journalism would, as a man, would attract you, as a conservative man, would attract you to Women's Hour?
Sorry, you're asking me?
Either of the men. So Robert, Charles, you want to go first?
Some people would say that it was old-fashioned to have a program called Women's Hour. Some people do say that because it shows that women are somehow treated in some special way that makes them inferior to men. But actually, I think that particular program has a good record of mainstreaming issues which primarily concern women, but actually concern the whole of society, and reflecting the fact that women are taking a bigger role in the public life of modern society. So that's what I would like from that program. That's what I think on the whole one gets. I think I well understand the point that's being made by Dunya and others, that this is this balancing act and that it's very difficult to strike the balance. But what worries me is that somehow Zara Mohammed hadn't prepared herself or been prepared for that fact. You know, here is this really big opportunity. It's an exciting moment that she's got this job. And here is a serious central mainstream program that's giving her a chance to say something, but she really, really doesn't want to say something. And I feel that could have been well worked out and rehearsed. And I think there's something else behind this, which is important. The Muslim Council of Britain is itself a controversial organization. And in fact, that was part of Emma Barnett's questioning. It wasn't just about that, because the question is, does it really represent Muslims? And at present, the British government does not engage with the Muslim Council of Britain because it doesn't believe that it is a truly representative body, and because it has sometimes appeared to give disproportionate power to extremists within it on certain very important questions, like whether you should kill British troops in Muslim countries, several highly, highly controversial issues. And I think, therefore, the sense that something was being evaded here was something that Emma Barnett spotted, and I think actually she was correct about, that this wasn't a wholly honest presentation of the situation. And I find with a lot of Muslim friends that they have anxieties about the Muslim Council of Britain along those lines. And there have been times when it's clear that a lot of spokesmen for the Muslim Council, for example, are constant advocates of writers like Hassan al-Banna or Maududi or whatever, who are not necessarily everybody's cup of tea by any means. So I feel it is very important, if Zara Mohammed wishes to engage as she should with the wider society, that she has thought through these issues and can talk about them.
Thank you very much. Robert, do you have anything to add?
Don't think I have. Charles put it all extremely well.
All right. So as a last question before the Q&A, I wanted to, and quite a few have already touched on this in what you said. I would like to hear how you think the interview could have been conducted successfully. You have already, Julie, you've touched on this, and Lordmore, you have just touched on this as well. What sort of things would you have liked to see differently, or where would you, if you were to give the advice to Emma or to Zara, what sort of advice would you give? Julie, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, I did have a conversation with Zara a couple of days later. And so we had a private conversation about it, and she asked me for my feedback, and I gave her much of what I've said today. So what I'm saying today is not really any different to what I've said to her in person. I don't know her very well, but I want to support her and all of that. I think let's just remember that, or you won't necessarily know that Zara was elected on the Sunday, and literally the whirlwind of interest from literally all over the world completely took her by surprise. She was not expecting there to be so much interest in her appointment. However kind of, historic she kind of knew it was, she still wasn't expecting the kind of interest that she'd had. So by the time she got to Woman's Hour, she'd actually done, I don't know how many, but many, many, many interviews, not just here, but in places in different countries as well. When it came to Woman's Hour, I think that she had perhaps not realized that some of the questions might be more challenging. And I think that, yes, there is no doubt that when you do an interview, you need some sort of preparation. And I think she does interviews really well, thank God. I'm very happy that actually she comes across brilliantly. I think she is very natural, and she does us proud, if I have to say it like that. But I do think that she will be, and has reflected on the fact that things may come in that you're not necessarily expecting. And I feel that had she thought about some of those questions, she could have answered them better, particularly the couple that I've already mentioned. I think when it comes to Emma Barnett and the way she approached it, I've said already, I think it was disappointing. I think it was a missed opportunity to be something. You can be challenging, but I disagree with, I think it was Charles, I can't remember which of the Charles or Robert that said that, if you're representative, you're like a politician. I don't agree. I think that she actually was not in a position of being questioned as a paid politician. It's a voluntary role. It's not taxpayers' money. There's no reason to make her feel that she has to somehow answer all of these questions in the first interview. I would hope that Zara and others can be on Woman's Hour much more. So why not create an atmosphere which was much more inclusive, much more positive? I felt that, for me, that was disappointing. So, and I get it that, I think someone's asked about Emma Barnett, so maybe we'll cover it after, but I think that her style is very different to what I've seen on Women's Hour. It's not one that I like as much as I have others. Let me say it like that. I've loved listening to it for many, many years, and I love it as a program. But I think her style is suited in what she was doing before, kind of Radio 5 Live and those kind of, more newsy type programs. Women's Hour, I think, it's perhaps, it'll be, time will tell, I guess, whether it kind of works. But I think that that's how I kind of see it, that it was a missed opportunity. You can ask challenging stuff, but this is not a politician who has to be answerable to taxpayers. This is a young woman who's just been elected. She's taken a lot on her shoulders. She's admitting that there's loads to do. She's not saying that we've got it all sussed out. If questions had been asked in a more inclusive way, I think you would have found that Zara would have been honest about the fact that the MCB needs to open up more. The fact that when she was asked about government, dealings with government, it isn't a straightforward answer for her, because actually the relationship between government and MCB hasn't been great, as has already been mentioned. So I think, she's got all of that being asked to her at once, but she was on a back foot because of the way it was being asked as well. So I think, for me, there's learning on both sides. I know that she's definitely reflected on it, but also, of course, has now been caught up in this kind of whirlwind of reaction as well to it, which I think in some ways hasn't actually been helpful. I think some of it's been over the top. I think some of the kind of, using this by Muslims and by others to use it to kind of attack the BBC or sort of call out other things. I think some of that for me has just been over the top, which is why I've kind of stepped back from some of that. And I hope that we can just use it as a learning, as a moment to sort of celebrate. Now, what work are we going to do? Zara's got a lot on her plate. She needs people to work with her, to support her. And I hope that we can, focus on that as well going forward.
Thank you, Julie. And sort of the question came from Julie Ford, the question you referred to. She's been sort of talking about how there has been a lot of criticism on social media from long-term viewers of Women's Hour of Emma's confrontational approach, and she sort of asked us to comment on it. So any other suggestions how this interview could have been improved from both sides, Emma's style and Zara's answers? Well,
could I just say, because I was the one who said, she was being treated like a professional, which was my hypothesis for why this turned a bit tense. But Julie said, which I suppose I hadn't realized, that she'd been giving lots of interviews, and most of these had been very successful interviews. So I suppose you have to say, well, on one hand, you could say, well, you're bound, some of the interviews are bound not to go as well as you hope. But also, although she's not a politician, she is, the reason one gives interviews like this is with the intention of using the medium to put across a certain message. So I suppose what you can't really expect, and you certainly can't demand to be treated in the way that you would like when you are representing, when you're there because you want to put across a message on behalf of a certain organization.
No, I mean, I agree with you. And I think also the other thing to say is that part of what I think where another mistake, I guess, was when she kind of challenged, you don't challenge an interviewer on the question that they're asking either, perhaps. And so I felt that was probably not that helpful either. But again, she got caught up in a kind of in a series of ways of speaking then, and she couldn't kind of get out of it. It is a voluntary role. It's actually very different to being, a head of an institution or a politician. I still feel it's very different. I totally agree with you that she is there, as just newly elected into that position. And I think you're absolutely right that you go there knowing that you're going to be asked all sorts of questions. One of the things that I also said afterwards was, let's be honest, it's not going to be the harshest interview she ever does. It isn't. The way people are reacting, I'm thinking, guys, you need to realize she's going to come across, I think, harsher interviewers, harsher styles of interview, difficult questions. And, so some of it in that sense, I think we need to put in perspective as well. I really don't think it's the most difficult interview that she's ever going to do in her life at all. And so I think we need to kind of keep that in perspective. So I think on the one hand, yes, she's the kind of head of this umbrella body. At the same time, it's a voluntary role. We can't really compare it with other things, I don't think, in the same way. And I also think that, yes, perhaps, she wasn't expecting the kind of the challenging approach in such a way, purely because of the kind of whirlwind of interviews that she'd been doing for literally 5 days non-stop, from the Sunday to, I think this was on the Thursday. So I think that is part of the context, which is why I felt it is relevant here. And I don't think you can compare it with her being similar to a politician or a head of a kind of, you know, a Catholic institution, or maybe someone from a spokesperson from the Church of England, or, you know, senior rabbi of whatever movement. I think it, you know, it is different, and people need to understand. Yeah. Sometimes I think there's a misunderstanding that the Muslim community kind of structure is different as well. So it's not me making excuses necessarily. It's just kind of giving people a bit more context, and perhaps they don't realize that.
Yeah. Wouldn't that have been explained? Isn't that an opportunity missed? It is important that the structures are different in different religions about about who does what. Zara Mohammed had the opportunity to explain that.
Yes, she did. I agree. I agree. No, I agree. And, you know, one of the bits of feedback I said to her was, you know, if you asked a question like that, you need to kind of own it, not come across as if you're batting it back. But, you know, the question about female imams, actually, many Muslims I know would find that a difficult question, particularly in a context like that, on a kind of mainstream BBC program, to know how to navigate all of the things we've said already. So I think, yeah, it's about owning it and taking the opportunity to sort of respond, but to try and explain, you know, Muslim community structures while she's also trying to navigate all of this other stuff, I think is difficult. I think it does mean, which is why I said earlier about religious literacy, or certainly from a Muslim perspective, the understanding isn't good enough. There are too many stereotypes. There are too many people who think that Muslim women should do this or shouldn't do this, or should wear this or shouldn't wear that. Everyone has a view. You know, Muslim women have been spoken about and spoken at and spoken on behalf of for far too long. And so that's why we need to now think about, okay, how do we get more Muslims round a table with Emma Barnett's researchers for Women's Hour, so they get to know what the nuances are, get to know what kind of stuff we're talking about, rather than thinking of it just in sort of stereotypes and tropes, which we know never, you know, are never helpful. And I think that's really part of what happened here.
Yeah.
Thank you, Julie. We have a question from Tara, or a comment and question. She says, thanks everyone for a fascinating discussion. A couple of you mentioned that we are generally becoming more accepting in the West. What about the recent case of face coverings in Switzerland? Are we really becoming more accepting, or are we not paying enough attention to the importance of context and dialogue, something that has been mentioned by several panelists? And as a, you know, as an East German, I'm always amazed at this discussion that, you know, especially in sort of more socially conservative countries such as Switzerland, or perhaps even as Germany, when people talk about face and head coverings. And my grandmother was the first generation who didn't wear a head cover and who didn't wear sort of dark clothes as soon as you were married. So this historical forgetfulness of how recent face coverings are in the European context. If you look at photos from the Shetland Islands from the 1900s, everyone's wearing a face covering, right? So this is something that is always sort of very little mentioned in the public debate. But are there any comments on this? Are we not paying enough attention to the importance of context and dialogue? You're smiling. I'll point at you now.
Can I say?
Oh yeah.
Can I just take up the point? I think maybe Miriam, you were drawing the wrong conclusion from your very correct point that people used to wear, women used to wear face coverings in the West. It's, I think, precisely for that reason that people are suspicious of them now, because their folk memory of them is of an era of repression. And so what they're thinking is Muslims are more repressed than we are. That's what I think is going on there. And some of it is mistaken, I think, and I think it's particularly mistaken in relation to head coverings. I must say, in relation to face coverings, I think it is rather important, because if you're not allowed to look at the face of a woman, why are you not allowed to look at the face of a woman? Isn't that a way in which a woman is being repressed? This may in fact be a wrong interpretation of it, but I think it's a natural one. And it's for that reason, after all, that headdresses became less and less common in the Christian world.
Mm-hmm. Dunya or Alisa, do you want to respond to this?
Sure. I was going to let Dunya speak first, but I think Tara's question is really interesting, and I think that these two processes that we're seeing in society are not mutually exclusive. On the one hand, We're hearing more and more about acceptance and religious symbolism, and we're talking about, you know, and here in universities in the UK about Generation Snowflake, and about how we need to tiptoe around each other to not hurt each other and not get into each other's boundaries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that that's one thing that is happening in society, in Western society. At the same time, there is also, and I think it's part of this, right? There is also this push against religious attire, because it's seen as in some way not Western or oppressing, or this concept of women's self-oppressiveness. They're oppressing themselves. I usually don't. I think that dialogue is very important in these situations, because if I would have a conversation with anybody, I could explain to them why, you know, the fact that I have chose to live in an Orthodox Jew, and I'm sure Dunya could comment on this as well, is not because I've decided to lead a life that is oppressive. It's because I believe in a faith, and I have a relationship with God, or I have a relationship to my community, and this is the way I want to live my life. And the fact that people can judge on it, or the fact that in Switzerland now I can't wear what I believe is my religious decree to appear in society, I think that is something that is unfortunate, and we should have more of these conversations.
Yeah, can I just jump in really quickly? I do agree with, I think you raised a very interesting point, Charles, actually, about the interpretation of Miriam's example. And I think my response to that is, like, personally, as a Muslim woman, I'm not a fan of the niqab or the face covering. I think I prefer other interpretations that do not favor it, or say that it's not necessary. It's not an obligatory practice, basically. So I can see what you're saying about, you know, how the social memory of leaving this old historical practice behind, you know, is because we, you know, the idea that, oh, our women were oppressed at one point and we've progressed since then. I understand that that's probably where a lot of Western women and intellectuals and people, that's how they can think about this issue. But I think that the problem is when we want to come and lay out this progressive narrative on other communities who are thinking about it differently, or maybe have not, you know, internalized this conversation yet from within their own communities. So like projecting it on, let's say, Saudi Arabia, for example, or another part of the world, that they're just not modern enough yet, they're not progressive enough yet, they're still stuck in these very backwards ways, and their women still cover their faces, I think is not fair. Because, you know, just because one part of the world has chosen to move forward on a certain topic or a certain issue doesn't mean that now we must oppose, you know, or we must, you know, place this lens on to the rest of the world, basically. I think, you know, these issues need to come from within communities themselves. And if eventually people would like to, you know, progress in a similar way, then that is that community's right to do so. And if they want to take their time dealing with these issues from within their own traditional structures, then that's also needs to be acknowledged, that is okay to do. And we need to stop placing blame or pointing fingers at how backwards some people might come across, because they are not necessarily following our progressive timeline at exactly the same way and speed in which, you know, other societies have done it. And I think this goes back to kind of what I said earlier about kind of us forgetting about the kind of sometimes colonial processes that, you know, lead to this kind of overarching thinking, I think, when we are from the West projecting certain ideas and values onto other communities in the world. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there as a response.
We shouldn't be trying to project one view. I quite agree about that, and uniformity. But I think there's one other really important point here, which is within Islamic communities, there's actually been more wearing of veils in recent years than there was before. And I remember having an interesting conversation, for example, with a Muslim teacher at a school which was predominantly Muslim in southern England. And she said she was very worried by the assertion that was being made that Muslim women ought to wear the veil at school, because what she said was this empowered extreme people. They said this is the real Islam. And a whole load of perfectly devout practicing Muslim women who would not have worn the veil in their background were now being forced to by this pressure, or things like arguments about whether they can swim and whether they can sing and all those sort of things that take place in school. So that if we go too far in as a secular non-Muslim society in saying that faith must do what it wants, we must recognize that that faith doesn't have one single view about this, and we mustn't empower people who shout the loudest about what the right symbols and rules are. And you know, as a plural society, we must insist not on making people abandon their faith, of course, but in that we mustn't always take it at the valuation of the more extreme practitioners, and we mustn't let, therefore, the Muslims themselves, Muslim women themselves, be persecuted by the most strident voices.
But I think there's also something, I mean, I'm fairly, you know, similar to Dunya in terms of my own view about niqab, but I think it also, you know, the way you're speaking about it, Charles, is very much as if things are always imposed on those women that wear it. And of course, for many of those women, I'm not sure if you've spoken to women who wear either a face covering or headscarf or whatever, actually, in many cases, they're choosing to wear it, whether we like it or agree with it or like the look of it or not. Then, but actually, and in terms of Switzerland, I think where it becomes problematic, I don't have the figures to hand, and maybe I should have done my homework. But as far as I'm aware, the number of Muslims in Switzerland is low. The number of women wearing the face covering is really low. And so for me, there is a question around, well, come on, why are they using that? Once again, that kind of, you know, it's a very, very, I guess, easy one. The poor Muslim women, as I said earlier, that need saving from themselves because look at, they're all wearing face veil. No, they're not. There are very, very few Muslim women in Switzerland like there are here that are wearing it. The idea that more and more Muslim women are wearing face coverings, I don't know where that comes from, because certainly even in this country, it's not what I'm seeing. And actually what I am seeing is very much a surge in a brilliant way from young Muslim women challenging pretty much everybody in Muslim communities and others on who they are and what they choose to do, what they choose to wear, you know, how they interpret their faith. That stuff is exciting. And, you know, we very rarely hear from those young Muslim women who would, you know, have more to say than all of us on all of this stuff, not about face covering, about everything, about being a Muslim, about being a young woman, you know, inequalities in society. I think one of the problems we have in this country, I love this country, but one of the things I don't love is when we do what I think Dunya is also talking about, is almost as if we've got it all sorted out. We just don't. I mean, we're on a day to day where we are all in mourning about the fact that a young woman has been murdered by just walking home from one place to another at night, has been murdered. And we're reminded that, you know, 2 women a week die at the hands of a partner or former partner in this country. And our idea of equality is nowhere near sorted out. So this idea that we as a country can somehow be the, you know, the bastion of all things women's equality and the poor Muslim women that need saving, you know, I struggle with that as well, because I just don't think we are there. And so it's much more layered and much more nuanced, and people need to have choice and be able to have their voice heard. That for me is the most important thing.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we have sort of come to the end. I would like to thank the panelists again very, very much for joining us. I've really enjoyed this, and I'm sure our listeners have also, all sort of viewers have all enjoyed it. We have had a lot of comments. We've had a lot of messages. So thank you very much. We're reading them. We're reading through them. And if you've liked today's discussion, and I hope that, you know, this discussion has really, really shed light on how strongly gender and religion are connected, and how little we understand or really, you know, continue to explore the challenges that arise from this interconnectedness. If you're interested in learning more, then please check out our Gender and Religion Today course, which is an upcoming online course. So check the chat box. I think the URL should pop up for our website over there. And we welcome all feedback. We would love to hear from you after this webinar. So thank you again to the panel. Thank you for your insights and experiences. And I hope we shall see you very soon in another webinar. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.